Welcome to the Creative Penn podcast. I'm Joanna Penn, thriller author and creative entrepreneur, bringing you interviews, inspiration and information on writing, publishing options and marketing ideas for your book. You can find the episode show notes, your free author blueprint and lots more information at thecreativepenn.com, and that's Penn with a double N. And here's the show. Hello creatives, I'm Joanna Penn and this is episode number 710 of the podcast, and it is Saturday the 26th of August 2023 as I record this. It's also September this week, so just a reminder that we only have 1/3 of the year left. So what are you going to achieve creatively in that time? Send me a message and let me know. I'll talk about how you can do that later. In today's show, I'm talking to Stephanie Wytovich about writing poetry in the dark. And it's always lovely to talk about craft with a poet. And Stephanie is certainly enthusiastic about breaking the constrained stereotypes of what poetry is, as well as how we can break out of self-censorship, how to win a literary award, thoughts on the horror genre and the benefits of going to conventions and more. Even if you don't write or read horror, you will find this fascinating. So that's coming up in the interview section. So in publishing and book marketing things, well, Monica Leonell and Russell Nolte did a webinar on 5 trends that are shifting the future of publishing. And they have released it as a podcast on all platforms on their podcast, their show, Kickstart Your Book Sales. And I highly recommend listening to this. It's a couple of hours, but it's full of great information. The 5 trends they cover are the transition from retailer sales to direct sales, and they use the term wider than wide, which I quite like, and you won't be surprised that I like this given what I've been talking about for a while now. They split direct sales into crowdfunding like Kickstarter, subscriptions like Patreon, Substack, Ream and more, web stores, so Shopify, WooCommerce, landing pages where it's just one page to buy things, and conventions and in-person signings. So that's the bulk of the session really is about that transition from retailers to direct. Number 2 is distance to presence. The rise of in-person events and the connection with other humans in experiences, communities, live courses in cohorts instead of evergreen, book clubs and more. Now, both of these 2 things, the first 2 things, are what I'm definitely concentrating on and are more important in an age of AI content. Now, you know I am pro AI as a tool for real human creatives as part of our process of creating amazing things in the world. I'm absolutely for that. But of course, what we're seeing is a mass of AI generated content by different kinds of people, and that is not going to stop. So how do we prove we're human and differentiate ourselves from the mass of this AI produced content in order to make a living, reach readers as for basically what it will become free digital content drives revenue ever lower? So for me, it's about making beautiful physical products that people want, as well as selling digital books, products and experiences that people buy direct. So the money goes primarily to us and not the platforms. And also that we do more in-person things. So attend conferences, speaking if you are interested in doing that. Also, I'm focusing more on my Patreon community. And in fact, I just sent them a message with some things earlier. I'm going to do more live courses. In fact, I'm doing a meetup at 20 Books Vegas for patrons. So if you're interested, that will be in November in Vegas. I'm also going to do more live courses and more webinars as opposed to evergreen courses. And I'll have a tier in my Kickstarter for Writing the Shadow to attend my shadow sessions, which will be run live in various time zones in order to account for down under Aussies and Kiwis. There will be sessions for you. So that's the first 2 things that Russell and Monica cover. Then they have a couple of other things. They talk about shifting from backlist to an online relationship with the audience through things like subscriptions and more active email marketing. So what is interesting here is that they said, back when we all started, back in the day, you could pretty much be a full-time author with 5 books in a series. That's what we used to talk about. Well, once you get to 5 books in a series, it will be great. And then, of course, 2016, 2017 was when 20 books to 50k happened. And it was like, yeah, you really need 20 books, preferably, obviously, in the same genre, all of that. Now some people with over 50 books are struggling and the backlist is swamped. And of course, again, the AI content will make the backlist even bigger. But they give loads of ideas about how to use the backlist to leverage in things like Kickstarters, and I will be doing backlist bundles as upsells. And of course, if you sell direct, all of us who are selling direct are doing bundles of backlist and doing different discounts and all of that. And many prolific authors are switching to subscriptions to get active readers involved and get paid up front. So there are lots more varied business models that we can use. Then 4 and 5, just quickly. 4 is gatekeeping to accessibility. So you might have thought we escaped the gatekeepers as indie authors, but Amazon has increasingly become a gatekeeper with KU as a gated program requiring exclusivity, shutting down accounts, regulating what can be published and all of that kind of thing. So the shift is towards the accessibility of being able to sell everywhere in every format. And then 5, casual readers to fandoms. Basically, instead of always focusing on trying to sell books to new people, which is what a lot of us have always done, it's about doubling down on your community and the people who love your work. So back to Kevin Kelly's 1,000 True Fans all over again. So loads of really interesting stuff in this session. As I mentioned, it's over 2 hours, so you can listen to this for free. It is on whichever podcast platform you're using. I'll link to it in the show notes. But yeah, thanks to Russell and Monica. Great stuff in there. And yes, they have a pitch for their events and their mastermind, which is absolutely right for some people. But the free webinar is fantastic. So definitely check that out. Also, very interesting that BookBub has an article out this week on direct sales strategies we love from 36 authors, and it has loads of stuff in. Examples include make direct buy links stand out, so readers have a choice, like don't put it last or disappear it. Add content or add context on why readers should buy direct, emphasising that they are supporting the author. Prioritise direct sales with special offers, and use a reading order page on your site. And I was thrilled to see that they have used my reading order from jfpennbooks.com. It's linked on the top of the screen, and my plan is to put that reading order in the back of all my books, and that reading order obviously has then the links through to the various books. Now, amusingly, I only added that like 2 weeks ago, so I was really pleased to see it got picked up by that BookBub article. You can also offer exclusive coupons, bundles, sell merchandise and swag and much more. So great to see BookBub doing that. Now you can use an external link in the normal BookBub ads, the pay-per-click ads. So I'm going to see what that does. I mean, I think one of the things is that BookBub has pretty much trained readers to get their books from the standard retailers, but we shall see. I think more and more people might try that. And in AI and futurist news, interesting blog post from Hugh Howie, the author of Wool and one of the best-known indie author success stories. He's blogged about his approach to AI. Now, he has been very clear that he does not intend to use AI as part of his writing process and will include that fact on a copyright page in his books. But he also says, I want AI trained on my work. I have a very positive view of AI. These models are, in a way, a distillation of our combined intelligence, our thoughts, our wisdom, our unique writing voices. I love being part of that. I love that we are all contributing to it and building something that will certainly outlast us individually and may very well outlast us collectively. When humans are extinct, our sun an old, tired red giant, and what's left of us is cruising among the stars. I like to think that some tiny sliver of me is out there intermingling with some tiny sliver of you. Also, guess what? You don't have a choice. Legally, 70 years after you die, your works will become part of the public domain. The idea that AI is never allowed to be trained on your data is just wrong. It's a matter of when. If you want to delay it as long as possible, awesome, go for it. Just know that it's a temporary thing. Now, I agree with Hugh on this, and I know it's a really contentious thing, but it's great that Hugh blogged about it because it means I can talk about it. Essentially, I have not blocked. So at the moment, you can add this robots.txt to your website and block the AIs from scraping your site. I have not done this. I do not want to block any of the bots or OpenAI or anything from scraping my site. My site has been scraped from the beginning of time. From when I started putting it up, our websites have been scraped by Google, and they have for generative AI, Google Bard. You can't escape this. I don't think that you can escape this. I also haven't included a no AI training clause in my book, as some people have advised. I think the future of search and discovery is AI powered, is generative AI powered. So I really want Joanna Penn and JF Penn to be part of the future. I don't want to be invisible to the large language models, just as I don't want to be invisible to Google or to Amazon. You are welcome to exclude your works. Of course, it's a personal choice. So put in your books and on your website, do not scrape me, etc. But I'm with Hugh here. I do think there will be some licensing changes, so we'll be able to get paid to be part of that. But at the moment, I'm positive and happy about being part of this, and I want my work, my voice to be discoverable. And in fact, if you go on ChatGPT or Claude or whoever or Bard and you say, what do you know about Joanna Penn? It will tell you some interesting things, and you are welcome to say, pretend you're Joanna Penn, please give me a pep talk on why I should finish my book today or why I should go writing today. If you do that, it might even speak in my voice, which will be quite cool. Well, not speak, literally speak, but write something back to you. So interesting. Also in AI, 11 Labs is out of beta, which means it's available to everyone. So many indies already use 11 Labs to generate audiobooks with AI voices, as well as audio versions of newsletters, websites, video narration and more. You can also clone your voice. It has support for more than 30 languages. That's at 11labs.io. Links in the show notes as ever. In June this year, 11 Labs entered into a partnership with Storytel, which is one of the biggest audiobook companies in the world, with the goal of Voice Switcher, which will allow enhanced personalization of the Storytel service at scale, facilitating truly unique listening experiences customized for every ear. Now, I have talked about this for years, that I want to be able to switch the voice of an audiobook to a different one. And many people, including myself, have stopped listening to an audiobook when you can't stand the voice. It's just like, oh, I seriously cannot listen to this voice anymore. And anyone who feels that way about my voice isn't listening to this. But I know it happens. We all have preferences around sound. It's a very personal thing. I would love people who don't like my voice to listen to my audiobooks in another gender and accent. So what if you want a southern US male voice or a Scottish woman or whatever you fancy? I would like you to be able to do that. So I'm really interested in this, and I will be checking out 11 Labs in more detail. But for now, if you hear my voice on this show or in my audiobooks, it is still human me. I will tell you if I'm using a voice clone. I don't have any problem with using this type of stuff, but I am still a human narrator. So I'm protecting some of this. So in personal news, I'm still deep in writing The Shadow, Turn Your Inner Darkness into Words, which is my next non-fiction book for writers. I have been editing this week. So essentially, I decided to edit the first 2/3 of the book because I was pretty happy with those. So I edited those. I've pretty much almost finished. I'll finish that tomorrow. And for this pass, I print it out, I hand edit it, and the pages are seriously a complete mess of scribbles. I might share some pictures with my patrons, but it is quite satisfying and it's helping me figure out that final third of the book. There's also something in the air around The Shadow right now, which is interesting. Chuck Palahniuk was on James Altucher's podcast talking about the shadow. And of course, Chuck wrote Fight Club, which I have already written about in the shadow book because it's a classic example. Also, Austin Kleon's email newsletter yesterday mentioned psychologist James Hollis, who specialises in the shadow and whose audiobook I've been listening to, and also mentioned Carl Jung's Red Book, which features in Writing the Shadow as well as my thriller Stone of Fire. So it'd be really interesting to see whether there is a zeitgeist around this and whether this is sort of coming back into the collective creative consciousness. I mean, again, the interview today with Stephanie is a lot about this too. So really interesting. Also, personally, in terms of preparing for the Kickstarter of Writing the Shadow, I got a test print of the gold foil on the cover. So haven't finished the book yet, but got a cover printed and mocked up by Book Vault, and it's awesome. I love it. I've never had foil on a cover, and it shimmers in the sun. I made a little video for my patrons to share how cool it is, just sort of rotating the book so you could see the sun. Well, the cover, it's not a book yet. I also mentioned last week it's going to have a ribbon, and Emily emailed. She said, a ribbon, 3 exclamation marks. Oh my goodness, Joe, more 3 exclamation marks. This is thrilling. And yeah, it is. It's so funny how much we love these things and how giddy we are about making really beautiful books. And this is definitely part of sort of how I'm changing my business model, is very much towards making more and more beautiful physical products, becoming like a better publisher in general and not just relying on digital, what we have done for many years, but is now really shifting as a business model. So yeah, that special edition with gold foil and the ribbon will only be in the Kickstarter. So unlike with Pilgrimage, I continue to sell the special hardback with photos and everything. I still sell exactly the same one. It's not signed, but although you can buy signed editions. But with this Kickstarter, this Writing the Shadow edition with gold foil and a ribbon, that will only be in the Kickstarter. And then there will be a hardback afterwards, but it won't have either of those two things. So if you're interested in getting that book, there'll also obviously be ebook, audio, normal paperback, workbook, bundles, as well as my shadow sessions, live online writing course and other things. The pre-launch page is up now at thecreativepenn.com/shadowbook. And I'll also be releasing a batch of consulting sessions again. This is the only way I do consulting, one-on-one consulting sessions now, is with Kickstarters. So sign up for the pre-launch as they sold out almost immediately. So you'll want to be on thecreativepenn.com/shadowbook. So thanks for your emails and comments this week, and X's, if that's what we're calling them. Deborah left a comment on the Tonya Ellis interview about school visits. I did my first school visit today for free and it was excellent. Thanks to you, I thought about how I could make the visit more interactive than a simple book reading, and the reaction from both students and teachers was excellent. I was really touched at how enthusiastic they were. They want me to come back to read another in the series for the students, and they're setting up the means by which parents can purchase my books through the school. I've been floundering when it comes to marketing ideas and I'm naturally shy, so this experience was a real boost to my confidence in getting on and marketing this series. Thanks again, you really helped. And that was just wonderful. Thanks, Deborah, for letting us know about that and putting that comment on Tonya's interview. I agree. I think it was super useful. And this is so cool. This is why I still love doing the show. I know it really does help. Also, Jim left a comment on Joe Solari's interview saying, good interview with good insight and information. Jim also said, I have a picture of Fort Rosecrans Cemetery in San Diego to send to you. Where shall I send it? Now, I love this because, yes, I love seeing pictures of cemeteries and graveyards and ossuaries and crypts around the world. JF Penn loves all of that. So, yes, I also love the comments and everything you send me. I really enjoy that. So you can X me or send me an X, whatever the language is, at The Creative Penn with a double N. I'm pretty much back on X, which used to be Twitter, of course. It really is the most useful for me and where I learn the most from other people. So yes, I'm back on X at The Creative Penn. You can also leave a comment on the podcast show notes at thecreativepenn.com or on the YouTube channel, or you can email me and tell me where you're listening and what your comment is, joanna@thecreativepenn.com. I love to hear from you. It makes this more of a conversation. So today's show is sponsored by Written Word Media, because however you write your books, you're going to have to reach readers somehow. And Written Word Media knows that marketing your book can be one of the most challenging parts of being an author. That's why they make marketing easy by providing quick, easy and effective ways to promote your books. Written Word is best known for their email promotion sites, Free Booksy, Bargain Booksy, and Red Feather Romance. They have 5 promotional sites that send daily newsletters to a combined audience of over 1 million readers. They also have a site to promote audiobooks called Audio Thicket. When you purchase a promotion with Written Word Media, your book is sent to thousands of readers who love and read books in your specific genre. As the email hits inboxes, you'll see a flurry of sales or downloads of your title. They have announced new categories as well as new partners as the audience expands, and there are non-fiction as well as many fiction categories. Email promotions are priced based on how many readers are in the genre, ranging from $25 to $500. You can also add on reader reach Facebook ads. They've also introduced promo stacking options where you can schedule the Fussy Librarian, Hello Books, eReader IQ, as well as free Booksy, Bargain Booksy, and Facebook ads for different genres. To help you get the most out of your book promotions, Written Word Media has launched Premium Membership, and I'm in the Premium Membership. It gives authors 10% off book promotions and special access to products and services, like their new partnership with Yonder, the serial fiction app. I find the membership useful personally, as it reminds me to book more slots and works out to be more cost effective for multiple promotions per year. And it keeps me reminded to put the promotions on to make the most of my membership. So visit writtenwordmedia.com/membership to take advantage of the discount, or email them info@writtenwordmedia.com to ask for recommendations. And Ricky was on the show a couple of weeks ago, Ricky Wollman, talking about some of this ad stacking stuff. It was really interesting interview, so go back and have a listen to that. So this type of corporate sponsorship pays for the hosting, transcription and editing, but my time in creating the show is sponsored by my patrons, and they support the in-between-episodes for AI, and I've got one coming up on AI images and book covers in the next few weeks. I'm especially grateful to those patrons who've been supporting this show for years and months. You are amazing. And thanks to new patrons this week: Nanette Potter, Dino Manrique, Jamie Joyce, K&E Southworth, Kelly Dugan, Philip Van Ennis, Thomas Hagstrom, and M.A. And if you support the show on Patreon, you get my extra monthly Q&A for patrons only, where I answer your questions about writing craft, publishing, book marketing, making a living with your writing and more. I've also been doing extra videos. I'm going to be doing a lot more with my patrons based on what I talked about earlier, from sort of making the most of subscription and direct sales. Patreon for me is one of my sort of direct to you lot things. And even just this afternoon, I sent an email with a little video about the gold cover and also a meetup at 20 Books Vegas. So if you support the show, you get access to all of that. And it's only not very much, like a coffee a month or a couple of coffees if you're feeling generous. You can support the show at patreon.com, patreon.com/thecreativepenn. Right, let's get into the interview. Stephanie M. Wytovich is a Bram Stoker award-winning poet, as well as a horror novelist and essayist. She's also the poetry editor for Raw Dog Screaming Press and the editor of Writing Poetry in the Dark, which is fantastic. So welcome, Stephanie.
Hi, thank you so much for having me today.
Oh, no, I'm really looking forward to our conversation. But first up, tell us a bit more about you and how you got into writing.
Yeah, so I wear a lot of hats in my day-to-day life. So I teach literature and creative writing. I work in a couple of undergrad and grad programs. And then I'm writing, and I had my first child back in 2022. So writing has kind of been, it's this constant catharsis and kind of like quiet time to collect my thoughts during all of the madness of my day to day. But I've been writing for as long as I can remember. I've always loved to make up stories as a child, and that kind of, the only thing that really changed was that they got darker and darker as I grew up. And then they just continued to get more morose and terrifying as I moved further into adulthood. But writing, and especially writing poetry, has always been kind of what I identify as in everything, first and foremost. Poetry has really changed my life in so many ways, which is why I was so honored to have the opportunity to put out this book with Raw Dog Screaming Press, Writing Poetry in the Dark, because I want to bring some of that joy that poetry has given to me and kind of share it to make it more accessible with other people.
There's a lot there, but you said that you really identify with poetry. So I want to get into that first, and then we'll come back to some of the other darker stuff. But from your editor's note in Writing Poetry in the Dark, quoting from the book, you said, "I stopped trying to fit poetry in a box of what I thought it was, and instead opened my eyes to what poetry could be." And I love that, because I was taught poetry at school, and it's like, this is literature. You need to,
Yes.
It needs to be this particular thing. So tell us how we can do this. How do we allow poetry to break out, or how have you done this?
Yeah, I mean, I had a very, very similar experience. I think as children, we're given poetry all the time. We're reading nursery rhymes and fairy tales, and we're getting all of these different versions of poetry that are fun and creative and whimsical and dark and weird and all of the above. And we attach to it. And then something happens like around middle school. We're usually like introduced to Edgar Allan Poe, and we see how it can be dark, and we get Emily Dickinson, and we're like, oh my gosh, there's this whole other world. It's like, this is so cool. And then we get to high school, and like you said, it's very much like read 17 Shakespearean sonnets and write me a poem in iambic pentameter, you fail AP English. And it, like, all of the joy is just kind of like squashed, because it becomes this very serious, terrifying thing, right? And that's not saying that formal poetry isn't wonderful and expressive, because it is, but I think there's this shift where it becomes fun and imaginative to very serious and kind of scary, and we lose some of the creativity and joy that's associated with it. For me, my journey with it is a little bit different, odd. I'm not sure the right word to really pinpoint it. I started writing poetry when I was probably around middle school, maybe a little bit younger. I was in therapy at the time, and I was having a really hard time talking about some of the things that I was struggling with. And my therapist had recommended to me that I start writing poetry and keeping a journal to kind of say the things that I wanted to say, but trusting that nobody else was seeing them. And that really opened a door for me in a lot of different ways in my life to kind of get all the darkness out on the page and be really vulnerable without the fear of somebody reading it and judging me or something like that. And so I tried to keep my version of poetry and then the version of poetry that everybody told me that I had to be writing and reading very separate. And it wasn't until I would say probably later on in college, maybe my junior or senior year, I realized that I had all of this poetry that I wanted to start putting together, maybe as a collection. And so I gave myself a personal challenge, or maybe like a reading list, where I wanted to start reading 30 collections of poetry every year to see what was out there. So I read classics, I read literary, I read Pablo Neruda's romance sonnets that he wrote to his wife. I read tons of Poe and Anne Sexton and Sylvia Plath. And then I started reading a lot of contemporary writers that were getting more political with diversity and inclusivity. And I was reading Latin American poetry, and I was reading a lot of, Black voices and queer voices. And when I was seeing how there could be this shift, that everybody's poetry looked different, it was kind of my light bulb moment that I don't want to say that there isn't a definite way to write poetry, because we can all read poetry and kind of be like, oh, this person really gets it, or maybe this person still needs a little bit of work in their writing. But it really opened the door that I could be creative and kind of push boundaries. And it didn't have to be this right or wrong way like I got when I had to write my sonnet in AP English. And then it was really funny because last year I had an editor reach out to me who specifically wanted me to write a Shakespearean horror sonnet. And I laughed and I was like, oh my God, if somebody could find my Achilles heel, like this man did it. Like this man is like triggering all of my poetry woes. And I really I had a moment where like, do I want to do this? And then I absolutely was like, I actually have to do this. It's like, I have to prove to myself that I can sit down and do this, but do it my way. And when I finished the poem and it eventually sold, it was kind of like my crowning achievement that like somehow I had gone full circle in life and everything was going to be okay.
It's so interesting listening to you talk about it, because you have novels, you have essays, you edit, so you see all these different things. I struggle enough with a short story, and it almost feels like the intensity level of a poem is more than the intensity of a short story, which is more intense than a novel. And so when you say like, oh, I just read 30 collections in a year, like I have quite a lot of poetry on my shelves and I like reading poetry, but it's almost like I'll pull a book off and I'll read one poem and then that will be enough. So I know you have a poetry collection coming out. So maybe tell us about, how do you put one together and how do you balance this intensity idea with a collection, which is almost like, I don't know, 60 novels or something?
Yeah, it's
level.
It's so wild. Well, this next one that's coming out is unlike anything I've ever done before. So it's called On the Subject of Blackberries, and it's coming out from Raw Dog Screaming Press in September. And it is a collection that I quite literally wrote in 3 months when I was postpartum right after having my first child. And I guess which is already like a weird thing, but like to make it even stranger. So kind of how I came about writing it was, so I had a really, really difficult time postpartum, and I was diagnosed with depression. I had postpartum OCD, which is still something that I'm struggling with. And then I was trying to adjust to being a new mom. Like I had every feeling and probably feelings that nobody's put a name to yet, like kind of on my shoulders. And my comfort book, which is something that I read pretty regularly, is We Have Always Lived in the Castle by Shirley Jackson, which I know is a weird comfort book, but nevertheless. And so I picked that up because I wanted something familiar and I wanted something to kind of quell my nerves. And I started writing poems that were inspired by the book. And I was using automatic writing and I was using bibliomancy and I was using all of these kind of more alternative, kind of witchy writing, creative writing discourses to kind of pull poems from the book and from my head. And it's very, very vulnerable. It's very dark, especially when you consider the time period that I was writing it. And I was using blackout poetry and found poetry. And I quite literally lost myself in the book. And so for me, it was kind of like a homecoming. Like I felt like when the book was done that I had almost like exorcised something that was in me that needed to come out. And I can't say that I've necessarily felt that way with putting a collection together before, because my approach is always very thematic. Like with Apocalyptic Mannequin, I knew that I wanted to write kind of like dystopian science fiction, world ending kind of poetry. And so that was how I started to build my poems and look at themes and different artwork and stuff like that for inspiration. But with Blackberries, it was very much like I just reached in and pulled something out of me and stuck it on the page.
That's so interesting. So you said a couple of things. You talked about getting the darkness out on the page and that you feel like you maybe exorcised something when you write that way. And I feel this exactly. And this is why I think horror writers are actually the most mentally sane and well-adjusted people.
Yes.
Because you take all the bad stuff and you put it out there in some form. And of course, it might be some metaphorical form, or it might be a poem or novel or whatever. But you also touched there on depression therapy.
Mm-hmm.
So where's the line between writing that is therapy and writing that is, because we're publishing these things for a reader. So where's the line between that, looking inside and then thinking about the reader on the outside?
Yeah. So I think sometimes there is a good crossover, and I think sometimes it just has to be separate. I have poetry that I've written that no one will ever see. I don't care how desperate I ever get to have something published. Like, it's just not getting out there. And I think that's really healthy. I think sometimes we do have to write for ourselves to remind ourselves why we're doing this. But on the same token, sometimes I will read those same poems and I will find a line, or I will find an emotion or an image or something that I think I could work with and kind of play with genre a little bit with it. And I might write something completely separate that kind of plays with those ideas, but isn't that idea, if that makes sense. And so a lot of the time, I think, we can really, and I guess that in itself is kind of therapy, because you're continuing to process and have conversations with yourself. Just one way is a little bit more blunt and one way is a little bit more hidden if you're talking about monsters and the supernatural and stuff like that. But that's something that I feel like I take that over into my fiction too, because sometimes when I'm really struggling with, if I'm at a point in my story and I don't really know where to go with it, I'll start writing poetry based on the short story that I'm writing, or I'll start writing in my character's voice. And that usually helps me unlock things. And sometimes the things that it unlocks are emotions that I haven't been able to kind of pinpoint yet. And so I do get very vulnerable in my fiction that way. So I think they ebb and flow and work with each other. But a practice that I do myself and that I've started encouraging a lot of my poetry students to do, and this will feel very scary when I say it, is to keep a shame journal. And so it's all like, I have a little notebook where I write down like all the things that embarrass me, or that I would be kind of like afraid if somebody ever found them out, like little quirks and maybe things that aren't necessarily so quirky, like things that just like gross me out or things like that. And when I feel like I'm in a place where I want to start playing with that and start having some of those conversations, I'll open that notebook up and start writing poems based on it. And I did that once with a piece called The Crone Confessions that I published in Black Telephone magazine under Clash Publishing. And it is one of the darkest things I swear I've ever written. And people respond so well to it every time, because it takes it a step further than I feel like most people expected me to go with it. And I think if we can find a way to acknowledge our lines or acknowledge where we put our boundaries, and then start having conversations with ourselves about why those boundaries are there, what those boundaries are protecting us from, and then slowly start inching over them in our writing, I tend to think that that's where the gold usually lies.
And this is the heart of it, I think, is you talk there about the boundaries. And for many of us, we then censor. We're like, well, I'm not going to write that because, someone will judge me. My partner will judge me, my family, the reader, like anonymous people, but also people close to us. Right. So how do we stop that? And then they might not even write it in a journal, let alone in a poem to publish or a book to publish. So how can we stop self-censoring? What is your process for kind of moving that boundary so we can actually put stuff out there?
Yeah, I actually had a really good conversation about this with Zoya Stage and Katrina Monroe at StokerCon. We were on a Monstrous Mothers panel together. And so we were talking a lot about being mothers, writing about mothers, our own mothers, the whole kit and caboodle. And I think it was Katrina that said that she had heard a piece of advice years ago that she always tries to keep in the back of her head. And it was, write like your family or your loved ones are dead. And that is, it's fantastic advice, but it's really hard advice to swallow, because we do need to write. We can't censor ourselves in our writing, or everybody's going to feel like that wall is up, right? And that the reader can't access you or can't access the characters in the way that they're meant to kind of get the full picture of the story. But it's also incredibly difficult because, like you said, that these people are going to be reading or hearing conversations about your work. So for me personally, that is something that I have been trying very hard to keep in the back of my head as I continue writing now. But it took me a very long time to get to a point where I was okay with starting to cross over some of those walls that I built. I would say I put out maybe 4 or 5 collections of poetry before I really felt like I started to take off a mask and show readers like who is actually behind and what I was capable of. So I think the best advice here is that it's something that you have to practice. The more that you do it, obviously, the easier it's going to get. And I would just challenge yourself every time that you're writing a story or a poem or working on a novel, take a brick out of the wall every time. Try to push yourself it doesn't have to be leaps and bounds, but just a little bit further and see how that feels and sit with it. And then pretty soon it's going to be muscle memory. You're going to feel more confident. You're going to know how to talk about it. You're going to know how to really put it on the page, and it won't be this scary, threatening thing anymore.
Yeah, I also feel it was my 5th novel called Desecration, which was when I was like, no, I'm writing this now.
Yeah.
But it's interesting. I mean, I agree with you on thinking that it, write as if everyone else is dead.
Yeah.
But in reality, they're not. And
yep.
So, and I mean, my mum has said to me, I can't read that. It gives me nightmares and I don't know what I did to you.
Oh, yeah.
And I'm like, you did nothing to me. That's not necessarily where these things come from. Although, mothers, we could talk about mothers another time. But why? Well, I guess, where do you think this comes from? I almost think that perhaps those of us who are into the darker things are maybe born this way. I don't know. Where do you think this comes from?
Well, I know for me personally, I feel like I could pinpoint it very specifically.
Oh, okay, great.
So I've told this story a couple of times, so I think my parents are used to it at this point. But my family is very, very much like the Addams family. So like Halloween was always our Christmas. We've always been very spooky. My parents love horror. My mom used all of my childhood things growing up were spooky and weird. I had a clown that sat on a swing, like right next to my crib, my room.
Not a clown.
It was absolutely, it was very creepy. And I hated Halloween and I hated horror because it was everywhere and I was terrified of it, but it was almost kind of like I didn't really have a choice. Like I was going to grow up to be Wednesday Addams or I wasn't going to fit in the family. And eventually I think my mom started showing me what horror could really be. It didn't have to be jump scares. It didn't have to be slashers. I can remember the first time I sat down and watched Interview with a Vampire with her and was just fascinated by vampires and like how romance could be kind of partnered with horror. Or then like the first time I watched Evil Dead and saw how comedy could be with it and how it also was having these like massive discussions about things that I desperately wanted to talk about, but was afraid to, but I could talk about them under the veil of like a spooky horror movie. And once I think I kind of cracked that code, I recognized the potential for horror and I just never looked back. Like, I think that it just gives us such a platform to have such difficult discussions, whether they're personal, political, like emotional, whatever you want it to be, but to talk about them like behind the cover of like a werewolf or the creature from the Black Lagoon or Frankenstein's monster. And I love that. I feel like it's very freeing. It's very, horror doesn't judge you. It doesn't sugarcoat anything. It just is what it is. And I think as a kid, it's so hard to just be who you are. And horror just gave me the confidence to do that. And so that's why I was so drawn to it. And I continue to think that's why I kind of have stayed here, because the community on the whole is so welcoming and so loving. And just, they want to play and they want to have fun, but they also want to have these really intense conversations that I think we need to be having right now. So it continues to inspire me relentlessly and positively and all the other good adjectives that I could put there.
Oh, that is so interesting. I think for me, it's maybe the opposite in that I always had a dark little soul, but I was brought up in a sort of the power of positive thinking kind of thing.
Oh, yes.
You're not sick. It's all in the mind. You just need to think positive and you can do anything. And so I pushed all of that. You know, I always had to be positive and happy. Wasn't allowed really to be sad or any of the things that might be considered darker emotions.
Right.
Yeah, so it's interesting to think where we came from. But you said there that horror is not just jump scenes and slashers. And I totally agree with you. Like, I don't do either of those things. I don't watch those things. I don't read those things. But you also said it is what it is. Horror is what it is. But you say that, and so many people have these wrong impressions of what horror actually is. And that some of the stuff I've read, I mean, it feels to me very literary, very experimental, very kind of weird, to be honest. And that's maybe why it's not mainstream as opposed to what people think it is. So what are some of the things that the word horror can encompass?
Yeah, I kind of chuckle too, because when I see these conversations about what horror is and isn't, it feels like a reflection to me of like what poetry is and isn't. And I think people are so desperate to put a label on things. And if something isn't this binary black and white situation, like people start to panic. And I always tell people, like, when they ask me like, oh, who was your influence? Why did you start writing like horror poetry? I always say I worshiped at the church of Plath and Sexton. And I don't think that the majority of readers and poets would say that Sylvia Plath and Anne Sexton are horror poets. But to me, they were. And they unlocked something that I thought was so dark and powerful. And it pushed me to kind of start having those conversations with myself. And I guess to answer your question, I mean, horror and what scares us is going to be different for every person. Everybody's going to have a spectrum of what they think a genre is, what it can be, what it isn't. And ultimately, I think that's a good thing, because it forces us to keep having conversations about our relationship with the genre and where we want to push it, where we want to see it go. But I don't think that we need to be so concerned about putting it in a box. And I feel like with a lot of things in life right now, that's kind of where we're at. We want simple, direct words to describe everything. And like, that's not the human experience. That's just not, humans aren't like that. And so I think we need to worry a little bit more about what things can be, how we reinterpret the haunted house as a metaphor for queerness, or how we look at the transformation of a werewolf and how that can relate to sexual assault and have bigger conversations, what's going on. Like, those are the things that I think we need to focus on, because I watched, it was a documentary series that they put on Shudder called Queer for Fear. And it's a very short documentary about the history of horror and how it is positively just completely gay, which I firmly believe that it is. And it was so eye-opening and beautiful and sad and wonderful, because it showed essentially how monsters were a metaphor for queerness. And I think that we're at a point now where we can take that even further. And I think we need to focus on how we can keep building the genre rather than trying to like stuff it down into that box and give it a name, because horror is so much bigger than anything that we can talk about, because it's different for everybody.
Yeah, it's interesting. I mean, monsters are pretty much always a metaphor, right, for something.
Right.
I've actually just written a monster novel called Catacomb, and I know what the monster is a metaphor for. I haven't really talked about it. So I won't talk about it, but it's almost like, yeah, I mean, we kill the monster somehow, and maybe we have to keep killing the monster in lots of different ways in lots of different books. But is the labeling a problem because of basically Amazon and the way we shop online and the way we use these categories? I mean, even in a bookstore, what annoys me, actually, I'm here in the UK, and it annoys me in a bookstore because I literally will go to the tiny horror section, which might be 2 tiny half shelves, and it is just Stephen King, maybe a couple of Dean Koontz, and then it will be really old books where the authors are dead, like a Edgar Allan Poe, like you say, and it won't be modern horror. But if you go to the sci-fi fantasy section, you will actually find books that you and I might call horror.
Absolutely.
Like you mentioned vampires. I mean, anything that has a vampire could technically be horror, but now it's kind of, is it dark fantasy? Is it romantic fantasy or whatever? So maybe that's the problem, is we have to shelve these things somehow.
In the US right now, I've noticed that there's typically like 3 Barnes and Nobles that I will usually shop at, and their horror sections are booming now. And it's so exciting because my experience was very much like yours for the majority of my life. But I feel like in the last maybe 2 or 3 years, like there is a prominent horror section. I'm seeing so many of my friends' books on the shelves. Like I have booksellers who are like putting Mexican Gothic in my hands and Mallerman's Daphne in my hands. And it's very exciting. But that's a very new development. And I think that people are still, I think there's always been a stigma on the label of horror. Like we've always been like the redheaded stepchild of publishing for whatever reason. Mm-hmm. But I think we're starting to see that break down, and people are starting, I think booksellers and publishing, I think are starting to realize like how big that readership is. And also that like people maybe who haven't even previously been interested in horror are kind of flocking to that now, especially like I say post-pandemic, but I think we're still kind of in some way, shape, or form, but post-pandemic, because it's therapeutic to read. Like we have our own personal horrors that we're all dealing with. And it's kind of nice to be able to see somebody else go through something scary that's not us. Like there's a anxiety transfer that happens. And so I think the face of horror is starting to change a little bit. And I think we're seeing people be a little bit more accepting and kind of testing the waters. Like, okay, if we start putting Eric LaRocca's like queer violent horror fiction here, how will readers, like who will flock to that? And everybody flock to it. And like, I think they're testing the waters to kind of see how it works, and they're seeing how hungry people really are for it. So hopefully that'll continue to change, and we'll see it all over the place with these sections being more recognized and horror being talked about more broadly. I think we're seeing agents pick up horror and say they're specifically looking for it more. So I hope this isn't a trend, but rather just a new move in a very positive direction for all of us.
Oh, no, that does give me hope, because often these things start in the US and then move into other places. So yeah, that is really positive. I also wanted to ask you, because you're a multi-award winning writer and editor, so you see both sides of the publication process. And what I have also noticed about horror is it can be pretty literary, and they're also often standalone, because of course lots of people sometimes die, sometimes, not all the time. But and I have really thought about this in terms of a lot more genre writers. So I write thrillers, as you know, have a long running thriller series. And it's actually quite difficult to enter awards with later books in a series because they might not make sense as a standalone. I guess, what are some of the things you see in award winning horror fiction, and is, I guess, being a standalone one of them, and some of the differences between mainstream books and award winners?
Yeah, I think the first thing that's most important in this is self-advocacy. So I think that, and I know I'm really bad at this. Like I hate like constantly talking about like a project and like marketing it. And I feel like I'm kicking a dead horse, and people are like, Stephanie, please just stop talking what you're working on. But we have to do that, right? Nobody's going to advocate for us like we advocate for ourselves. So I think that that's something that like, it's going to be uncomfortable for a while, but we have to just keep doing it until it's not uncomfortable, essentially. And we have to, constantly, I think it's really important to be aware of the opportunities that are out there. Know the awards, know the editors, follow the editors on social media, try to build authentic relationships with these people. I mean, it's very obvious when somebody is trying to be your friend because they want something from you versus you legitimately being like, I'm such a fan of the work that you put out. Let me buy you a drink and let's talk about it. Like, I think building authentic relationships without the quid pro quo relationship is so unbelievably important. And it's such a huge problem with social networking. So I think that's something to keep in mind as you're growing and exploring and advocating for your work. And trying to be aware of the opportunities out there. And so when you have a project and you eventually find an editor, I think it's going to look a little bit different if you're doing something in the indie world versus in if in the commercial publishing world, if that makes sense. Mm-hmm. I think something to keep in mind constantly is that I feel like this is going to contradict everything I just said. Like, you don't want to work on a project with an award in mind.
Yeah. No, I agree.
You know what I mean? You want to be writing because you want to be writing. And because you need to write the story, and telling the story is fun. And when you're doing that, again, it's going to be authentic to the reader, that you're not putting in a checklist of things to try to get the Shirley Jackson Award or to try to get that Edgar Allan. So I think you have to be very honest and authentic with yourself. And then the questions that you have to start asking yourself are, how much of this am I potentially okay with changing? Is this vision something that's malleable, or is this something that I really want to keep it the way that it is? Because when you go commercial, if you're writing this bizarro, weird thing, one, it might not be able to be commercial. So your reach might not be as big. But if you go to an indie publisher and they love how bizarre and weird it is, and you know that this is the right fit and that they are going to scream it from the top of the mountains, your reach might be smaller, but that word of mouth, and once it finds that niche group of people, it will explode. And so I think you have to think about what your goals are and what your personal kind of artist statement is with that project, and constantly be having that evolving discussion with yourself from book to book or project to project, so you can see where the best fit it is. Because a commercial publisher may put it out, but it may not go to the right audience. You know what I mean? More people might have access to it, but it might miss the people that the indie publisher could have directly targeted. So I think it's a very complicated conversation, which I think is why it's so important. Kind of like how we were talking before, you want to find your tribe, you want to find your people, you want to find a really good editor, you want somebody that you can trust to give you good feedback and that can kind of help have these kind of rolling conversations with. And then I think the awards find you, honestly, because again, if they meet the right readers and they're in the hands of the right people, that stuff, you'll get the return on profit, the return on interest that you're putting out into the publishing world.
So you talk there about finding your people, and you're really active in the horror community and the Horror Writers Association. And you mentioned StokerCon before, yes. And we were talking before the recording, and I was like, I had a ticket when it was in the UK, but I haven't been. And I've been a member of the Horror Writers Association for a few years. But I wondered, what are the benefits for authors who are listening, who might be like, oh, I don't know. I mean, I'd love to find my people, but how do I know? So what are the benefits for authors to be involved with the community of writers, not just to be sort of seeking readers?
Yeah, they're countless, surely. So I've been an active member of the Horror Writers Association for, I think, 10 plus years now. And I'm not being hyperbolic when I say this, it has truly changed and enriched my life in so many ways. And it's also very different from when I attended my first World Horror Convention, years and years ago, where it still felt a little bit maybe a little bit cliquey. I was very shy. I didn't know exactly where I fit in. And now when I go as kind of somebody who's been to a lot of the cons and I see new people come in, it is so welcoming and inspiring. Nobody's going to let anybody be sitting in a corner. They're going to bring you to the bar. They're going to bring you to dinner. They're going to bring you in conversations. And there's just such a general excitement to be around people who just get it and who know those feelings. So I think in terms of finding your people, you truly can't find a better convention, a better organization of people who are just going to be there to support you. But beyond the lovey-dovey approach to this, there's so many educational opportunities for new writers, for professional writers. The HWA offers so many different scholarships for poetry, for nonfiction writing. They have diversity grants. They have the scholarship from hell that they give out to fund somebody to go to StokerCon and get the hotels and everything. They have a mentorship program where, let's say you wanted to start writing poetry, but like you don't know where to start. They can pair you up with somebody who's been working in poetry for years, and they can work one-on-one with you. They have stuff for young adult writing. Like they just added a middle grade section to the Stoker ballot. So the HWA is getting more inclusive and more diverse. And I mean, they have a mental health initiative where they're constantly having rolling discussions around self-care and how mental health is being depicted in horror. And I could go on and on and on. There are just so many facets of the organization that are there to support you, protect you, educate you, and just kind of mold you into the writer that you want to be. So I cannot recommend it enough. It has changed my life. It has given me so many opportunities. I got editing experience for them. I got scholarships that funded certain projects and books that I've been working on. Like it's wonderful. Just period. It's just wonderful.
You totally sold me.
Yes.
But I guess for people listening, it doesn't have to be the Horror Writers Association. It can be another genre organization, like wherever you feel, like you said, find your people. And I mean, that's it's the people who accept the type of thing that you write. So I'm not going to fit at a romance writing conference.
Me either.
Even though there is a crossover, some people do write horror romance or whatever. But yeah, I mean, I think that's the reality. And we're all weird, aren't we? We're all weird in our own little worlds. And it's nice to hang out with people who are weird in the same way.
Yes. Or teach us to be weird in different ways.
Yes, well, there we go. That's fantastic. So where can people find you and your books and everything you do online?
Yeah, so you can go to my website, which is stephaniemwytovich.com. I have a blog that you can access from that page where I host poet interviews and I do a monthly writing recap. I'm on social media everywhere as S. Wytovich. And then I also have a horror bookstagram account that you can find at the Haunted Bookshelf. And then my books are available anywhere that books are sold.
Brilliant. Well, thanks so much for your time, Stephanie. That was great.
Thank you so much. This was wonderful.
So I hope you found the discussion with Stephanie interesting and that perhaps you might try to push the boundaries of your self-censorship in your next writing session. And I go into more about how you can do this in Writing the Shadow. If you're interested in that book, sign up for the pre-launch page for the Kickstarter at thecreativepenn.com/shadowbook. Next week, I'm talking about producing visual, high-quality books and thinking differently with Holger Niels Pohl, which is a great conversation that I look forward to sharing with you. In the meantime, happy writing, and I'll see you next time. Thanks for listening today. I hope you found it helpful. You might also like the backlist episodes and show notes available at thecreativepenn.com/podcast. You can also get your free author blueprint at thecreativepenn.com/blueprint. If you'd like to connect, you can tweet me at The Creative Penn or find me on Facebook at The Creative Penn. See you next time.